A common issue I sometimes get is that people's robots just don't seem to drive the way they want. Sometimes it runs too slow, sometimes it doesn't turn too well, other times it just does wheelies. And oftentimes the issue is that they have the wheels directly on the motor. And this can be resolved by instead using a gearbox. So let's delete these, go to motion, transmissions, and let's look at our gearboxes. You've got a small gearbox, medium, large, and amp flow. Now, the kind of gearbox you use, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Ideally, you'd want something that fits what you're using it for. So with the wheel, you'd want to use the amp flow gearbox like they do in real life, or the medium or large gearbox. I'm not really sure what you'd want to use the small one for since it's just so tiny. Usually smaller weight classes, but I usually stick with the medium or large. So let's go with the medium, put that on. Then let's go ahead and copy the wheels over. Click the innermost wheel, Shift C, which is the copy, and put it on. And then let's go ahead and just do that. And slide this in. Delete these wheels. And bring it over. Now, as you saw when I clicked on that gearbox, it brought up a little section. Gearbox gear ratio. Now, right now, this ratio is running at 1:1, which just means that it's sending the exact ratio this motor has over to the wheels. So this is essentially running without a gearbox. And this is a problem because, like the aforementioned problems, you could be wheeling or moving too slow or not turning well. But also, if you look over here at RPM under telemetry, you'll see that right now we're getting about 8,000 RPM, and that's kind of a problem. The reason is, in Unity, which is the engine for Robot Rumble 2, it has trouble processing things with RPMs or speeds of above 1500, and I'm not sure why it's that number, but it doesn't seem to process those that well. So there is an alternate system in place for things that have a higher RPM of over 1500, but it doesn't seem to, it's just not that ideal. So instead you'd want to shoot for RPM under 1500. So what we have to do is we have to make the motor work less, do less rotations per minute. So we can do that by creating a bigger gear. So if we were to go, say, 5 for these, you will see it has gone down from 8,000 to about 1,700, which is good. But we can go ahead and bring it down even further if we say go 6. There you go. Now it is below 1500 and it seems to be running acceptably. Now, if you want it to have better turning, you can always fine-tune it to have better turning. It's just a recommendation that you keep this below 1500. Now, this is simply for a brushed drive. There is another type of drive you want to consider when you're gearing. This is a robot with brushless drive. Now, the main difference between brushed and brushless drive is besides the motors and ESCs, is the gearing. But if we go ahead and just open this up here, you'll see it has a lot of trouble turning and it moves very slowly. And if you look at the RPM, you can see that it gets pretty high, about over 20,000, and that is not something we want. So the way we can fix that is, again, gearing it higher. So if we gear this 10:1, you'll see that the RPM goes down, and the robot is a lot more controllable. Now, I will add, the whole 1500 rule that's mostly just recommended for performance. If you do decide to not listen to that, that's fine. There's just some builders that recommend that to other people. It's completely up to you, but it really all depends on how your robot performs and whether you're happy with it or not. So that wraps up drive. Now all there is to do is talk about weapons and self-riders. This is my robot Rolling Thunder, and I'll be using it to explain gear ratios for weapons and self-riding mechanisms. Now, I see a lot of people asking, oh, what's the best gear ratio for a vertical spinner, or horizontal spinner, shell spinner, saw? And the answer is, there isn't, because every spinner is going to be different based on shape, weight, and a bunch of other things. So if we look here at the spinner, it's circular with a couple teeth. If we look at the telemetry, we see it's about 19.1 kilograms. Now let's go ahead and spin it up and see what I've got here. Spins up fairly quickly. It's a slightly lower speed, and the amount of kilojoules is below 20,000 kilojoules. Now, this is simply my preference for it. I could make it a bit faster and as a result, get a bit more power behind it. But if I do that, let me go ahead and this. You'll see that it spins up, but it spins up to a much higher speed, and as a result, because of the higher speed, it has a lot more energy, a bit too much for my liking. So again, spinners can be made in multiple ways, so there is no right answer to the amount of the proper gearing for spinners. It's completely up to you. Now, if I were to gear it lower, so this, you'll see that it spins up much quicker, but you don't have much of a speed. Now, again, like I said, my preference is a decent amount of energy and fast spin-up time, but some people may want it to spin up over longer with the reward of more power. Now, let's talk about self-riding mechanisms. Right now, if we use my self-riding mechanism, it confidently does it. And it's able to get me off as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at my mechanism. If we click here, you'll see it's 10 to 0.1, which is as high as a gear ratio can go. And this is what's usually used for lifters, but it also helps when you have self-riders because it's able to easily lift the robot up. And let me show you. Let's change this to 10 to 1 and flip the robot over. As you can see, it's a bit too harsh when it comes to self-riding. And plus, if I go ahead and deploy here, you'll see the robot is freaking out. And that is because of the speed of it. I'm just simply tapping and it's hopping around like crazy. Now, if I go ahead and change this to 0.1, you'll see that it's not as bad. Now, ideally, 10.1 works well for me in most cases, but it's ultimately up to whoever, again, up to you whether you want a very fast self-ride or a more consistent and controlled self-ride like this. Let's talk about another robot now. Here is my shell spinner Mortal Spin. Now, what I say here can also somewhat apply to other horizontal spinners, but the main principle here is that this is much heavier than the weapon on Rolling Thunder. First, let's take a look at the ratio here. It's 1 to 0.1, definitely a lot higher than the weapon on Rolling Thunder. Now, if I go down to the telemetry and look at the weight, you'll see that it weighs a whopping 64.6 kilograms, a lot heavier. And when I go ahead and spin up the weapon, the robot does a little turn because of how much torque is used to spin up the weapon. And you can see here it still spins up quickly, but it's at a lower speed. Now, let's say I were to change this to be a bit faster. So 0.2. As you can see, it goes up higher, but as a result, it takes longer to spin up, especially since this is such a heavy object. And you can definitely see the difference here between these two numbers, how long it takes for it to reach the maximum amount of energy. Now let's try making this bigger. As you can see, it does a little 360, and it's a lot slower. So again, it really all depends on your preference when it comes to what you want from a spinner and how you want it to perform. Again, for this one, because it already has such a big amount of energy, I figured I don't need it to spin too fast, so that's why I went with this. Plus, it helps to be able to spin up quickly. Now, you may want to have more power, and more power to you. You can go ahead and gear it so that it has a more gradual spin up, but you get more speed. And that is pretty much it. Hopefully this was helpful to everyone, and hope you all have a great day.